Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. For 50 years, this house was my refuge, filled with the laughter of my husband and the memories we built together. But when my daughter-in-law raised her hand against me and my only son stood at her side instead of mine, I felt the walls close in as if I no longer belonged in the very home I created. My name is Margaret Holloway. I am 72 years old, and this is how love turned into betrayal, and how betrayal turned into my decision to cut them out of my will forever. The clinking of dishes reached me before I was fully awake, a sound out of place in the silence that usually filled my mornings. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling of my bedroom, the same high plaster ceiling I had looked at for more than 50 years. The room still smelled faintly of cedar and lavender from the sachets Edward liked to tuck into the drawers. For a moment in that blurry space between sleep and waking, I thought he might walk in carrying a tray with tea the way he sometimes did on weekends when he was still alive. But Edward had been gone since 2020, and the silence that followed his passing had become my constant companion. The clock on the nightstand read 7:30. Too early. Clara usually brought my tea at 8. I sat up, tightened the belt of my robe around my waist, and slipped my feet into slippers that had grown soft and worn with years of use. My knees ached a little as I stood the reminder of age I could not ignore, and I held on to the polished wooden banister as I descended the wide staircase. The house groaned with me, the old oak floorboards creaking in sympathy, every sound another echo of the past. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, a voice rang out from the dining room. "Good morning, Maggie." It was Vanessa's voice, clear and confident, carrying down the hall. She never called me mother, never even Mrs. Holloway. Always Maggie, as if we were equals or worse, as if I were just another guest in my own home. I turned into the dining room and found her standing by the buffet table, a pot of coffee in hand, her long hair pulled back neatly, her smile wide. At the table sat Rick, my only son, the boy I had raised through years of Edward's diplomatic assignments abroad, now 42, and absorbed in his newspaper as if nothing around him required his attention. "Morning," I said quietly. My eyes wandered around the room, searching for the familiar, but something felt wrong. It was not until my gaze landed on the buffet that I realized what had changed. The china set Edward and I had brought back from a trip to San Francisco nearly 30 years ago, delicate porcelain painted with cranes and cherry blossoms, was gone. In its place sat a row of stark white plates that looked like they had been bought yesterday at a big box store. "Where is the china set?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Vanessa waved her hand as if swatting away an insect. "Oh, that old thing, I put it away in the pantry. These new plates are so much more practical, you can wash them in the dishwasher. Without asking me." It came out flat, not a question, but the recognition of what had happened. Rick lowered the paper slightly and looked over the rim of his glasses. "Vanessa is just trying to help modernize the place, Mom. You know how hard it is to find someone willing to hand wash dishes every day." Clara never complained once in 15 years, I wanted to say, but the words stopped in my throat. My fingers tightened on the back of the nearest chair. I lowered myself into it, slowly steadying my hands in my lap. Vanessa poured herself more coffee, the scent of the brew filling the room. She moved easily in the space as if she owned it, her slender frame gliding between table and buffet. She wore one of her tailored blouses, pressed perfectly, her nails manicured pale pink. She did not belong to the kind of life this house represented, with its heavy drapes, the stained glass windows, the antique sideboards. and yet here she was rearranging and altering as if the house were hers to shape. Rick folded the paper and sipped his coffee. The silence stretched, and I found myself remembering the years when this same dining room had been full of diplomats and professors, Edward's colleagues and friends, the sound of glasses clinking against china and me at the head of the table guiding conversation toward art and history. Now, I sat at the side while my son's wife dictated what was suitable in my own home. The plates gleamed white under the morning light filtering through the stained glass, soulless and cold. I thought of the porcelain I had collected carefully with Edward, how each piece had its story. The set from San Francisco had been found in a small antique shop run by an elderly Japanese couple. Edward had bargained in his careful, respectful way, and afterward we had shared a quiet dinner in a Chinatown restaurant, proud of the treasure we had carried home. Every time I touched those plates, I remembered that day, the laughter, the warmth of his hand. Now those memories were shut away in the pantry, hidden behind a door, as if they no longer mattered. Practical Vanessa had said, practical had never been the point of this house. It was about history, about memory, about honoring what came before. I swallowed my protest, feeling it burn down my throat. Rick glanced at me, then back at his coffee, unwilling to see the storm gathering inside me. I studied my son's face, the familiar lines, the same shade of blue eyes as Edward's, and yet so different. There was no fire there, no loyalty, only a weary avoidance. He preferred silence to conflict even when it left me sitting alone in my own home, a guest at a table I had set for decades. The sound of Vanessa's laughter rang out as she scrolled through her phone, showing Rick something he barely glanced at before smiling politely. I looked at the plates again, their whiteness glaring under the light, and felt the weight of silence pressing against my chest. The morning stretched on heavy with what was unspoken, and I folded my hands tighter to keep them from trembling. When I returned to my study later that afternoon, I noticed the shelves looked strangely bare. My heart lurched. Entire rows of leather-bound volumes I had collected over decades were missing. The art history texts Edward used to tease me about saying I valued them more than jewelry were gone. I hurried down the hall and into the pantry. There they were, stacked carelessly on a bottom shelf beside bags of flour and tins of coffee, their spines pressed awkwardly against each other like forgotten relics. I touched the edge of one volume and felt dust already gathering on its cover. Vanessa appeared behind me, her voice light casual as if nothing were out of place. Maggie, these old books were taking up too much room in the library. I thought you might like more open space. I turned to face her, holding a volume in my hands. Edward and I built that library together, I said quietly. Every shelf has a purpose. She smiled in that polite way she often used, a smile that closed conversations rather than opened them. Spaces should breathe, she said. Modern homes feel lighter when they are not cluttered with too many heavy objects. I wanted to argue to demand that everything be put back, but Rick walked past the doorway at that moment. He glanced and saw us standing there and said lightly, "Vanessa is just trying to help Mom. You should let her." Then he was gone again, back to his laptop, back to his own world, where peace was more important than truth. Later that week, I found Edward's portrait missing from the living room wall. For 50 years it had hung there, his steady eyes watching over our family, his diplomat's bearing reminding me every day of his patience and strength. In its place now hung a framed print of abstract brushstrokes in shades of gray and beige. I stood in the doorway, unable to move. Clara came up beside me, her apron dusted with flour, her hands still smelling of bread dough. "It is not right," she whispered, her voice low. "Mr. Holloway should stay here where he belongs." I knotted my throat tight. "Then why didn't you stop her?" I asked, though I knew it was unfair. Clara looked down at her hands. "Mrs. Holloway. She speaks with such certainty, and Mr. Rick, he does not say a word against her." "I did not want to make things worse for you." I patted her arm, understanding her position. Clara had been with me for more than 15 years, loyal and dependable. I could not expect her to fight battles I had not yet fought myself. Still seeing Edward's face banished to the upstairs hallway made something inside me twist. It was as if Vanessa had decided which memories were worth keeping and which should be hidden. The final blow came when I entered the conservatory, the one space in the house where I always felt closest to life. For years, I had lined the windows with violets, their purple blossoms lifting the gloom of New England winters. Edward used to tease me that I treated those flowers like children talking to them, fussing over their soil. Now every pot had been replaced with thick green succulents in minimalist containers. They sat in perfect rows, sturdy, unfeeling, indifferent. I bent down searching for even a single violet, but they were gone. My hands trembled as I touched the cool soil. Clara entered carrying a basket of linens and stopped short. Her eyes softened. "She replaced them yesterday," she said, her voice apologetic. "She told me succulents are easier to care for." I felt something sharp rise in my chest. "Did I ever say I needed easier?" I asked. Clara shook her head, silent. That evening at dinner, I tried to bring it up, forcing my voice to sound steady. "Rick, did you see what Vanessa has done to the conservatory? My violets are gone." Rick hardly looked up from his plate. "Succulents last longer, Mom." She thought it would be less work for Clara. "It is not about Clara," I said more firmly now. "Those violets meant something to me. Edward and I planted them together after our first spring here." Rick finally looked at me, then at Vanessa, then back at his food. "She is only trying to make things better," he said, his voice flat. Vanessa reached across the table and placed her hand on Rick's arm as if to seal the matter. "Your mother has such sentimental ties to everything," she said. "It makes it hard to move forward." Rick gave a small laugh, not unkind, but not protective either, and my chest tightened. That night I walked through the house after they had gone upstairs, the floorboards creaking under my steps. Every corner seemed altered, every detail shifted. A new rug in the hallway, paler curtains in the sitting room, a lamp I did not recognize in the foyer. Nothing had been taken away completely, only tucked out of sight, replaced with something shinier, newer, emptier. I returned to the library and stood before the bare shelves, imagining Edward seated in his leather chair by the fire, reading one of the very volumes now hidden beside flour and sugar. He would have handled this with grace, no doubt, but even he would have felt the weight of being erased piece by piece. My hand brushed along the wood grain of the shelf, remembering how we had chosen it together, how proud we had been of this house. In that moment, I felt for the first time that I was no longer the mistress of this place. Decisions were made without me, traditions dismissed, memories folded away like clothes too old to be worn. The walls still stood, the windows still caught the morning light, but my authority had grown thin, transparent, like paper left too long in the sun. It was the first time I understood that my voice might one day be silenced here altogether. Candles appeared, first rows of tiny flames lining the mantel and the window sills, as if the house were a stage being dressed for a performance. I came down to find the foyer filled with floral arrangements. I had not ordered white lilies mixed with glossy monstera leaves that hissed faintly when touched. The mahogany table wore a white cloth that swallowed its grain, and the chairs had been shifted just enough that the room felt unfamiliar under my feet. A narrow runner cut the length of the hall toward the dining room, where a speaker pulsed a thin ribbon of jazz. It sounded expensive and bored. Vanessa glided out from the kitchen with a clipboard and a wireless earpiece tucked beneath her hair. She moved with the assurance of someone who had supervised a dozen galas and believed a private home was a convenient backdrop. "We are doing a plated service," she said, as if announcing the weather. "Clients from the agency, 2 potential donors for a museum partnership, a couple of investors." She touched the center of the table where a forest of silver-painted branches rose from mirrored glass. "It catches the candlelight," she said. "It looks like winter." I thought of the hand-carved bowl Edward had once filled with pine cones and cranberries around this time of year and felt a pinch along my ribs. Rick appeared behind her in a navy jacket, the collar too tight for his neck. He tugged at it, then looked at me with the hopeful smile he used when he wanted a situation to pass without effort. "Just tonight, Mom. Vanessa says a home setting makes people relax." He leaned to brush my cheek. "You look nice." He did not wait to hear me answer. By 7, the first cars were idling at the curb. Coats bloomed across the hall tree, Hermes silk and wool from Milan, the scent of white tea perfume and cologne that stung my eyes. A woman with glossy hair took both my hands and told me what a stunning venue this was. A man with a watch the size of a silver dollar said the crown molding must be original. Vanessa welcomed each person by first name, her voice bright the rhythm practiced. She called it our home twice before I had collected my breath. In the dining room, place cards waited like verdicts. Vanessa sat at the head, Rick at her right. My name sat at the far end near the door that opened to the kitchen. The new white plate stood at attention at each setting, flanked by silver. I had not polished myself. Crystal chimed. Laughter began to gather like rain. I hovered a moment, then took my seat. Clara passed behind me carrying a tray. Her eyes flicked to mine, apologetic, then she disappeared through the swing door. The first course arrived, a tiny square of tuna laid against avocado with dots of sauce that looked like punctuation. The woman on my left told me about a brand activation that involved a pop-up ice rink on a rooftop in summer. She laughed at her own story, and I smiled, thinking of the year Edward and I slipped on a real pond in Cambridge and came home soaked and laughing. My fork felt heavy in my hand. At the head of the table, Vanessa rested her palm on the white cloth and told a man in a velvet jacket that the house had killer sightlines for photography. Rick nodded. The man asked how long they had lived here. Vanessa answered before I could open my mouth. "Since last year." "We adore it. It has needed updates, of course." Midway through the fish course, someone mentioned Venice. A woman with diamond hoops said she and her husband had just returned and had paid a gondolier to let them steer. I felt my face warm with a sudden sun. Edward and I celebrated our 30th anniversary in Venice. I said, leaning slightly toward the center of the table so my voice could reach the group. We stayed in a small palazzo in the Grand Canal. One evening, a storm came so quickly the water lifted right up to the steps. Edward stood in the doorway and held out his hand to me, and the lightning made him look like a painting. Vanessa's laugh cut across the cloth. "Maggie has the best travel stories," she announced. "Truly, she can conjure a gondola in any conversation." Heads turned toward her, then toward me. The woman with the diamond hoops gave a polite smile that apologized for all of us. A man near Vanessa chuckled. Rick's mouth tilted. He did not look at me when he laughed. It was not loud or cruel, just a sound of alignment. It said, "I am with her." I stared at my son and could not find the boy who once lifted snail shells from a beach to ask if the ocean made its own jewelry. He kept his eyes on Vanessa as if she alone could translate him to the room. My fork touched the plate with a small clink that sounded like something closing. I placed the fork down carefully and folded my hands. The guests resumed their current. Someone described a restaurant in Tribeca where every dish arrived under a smoke-filled glass dome. Another talked about a foundation grant. Vanessa told them about the vase on the mantel, a limited piece by an up-and-coming designer. "Cost a small fortune," she said lightly. "It makes the room." The dessert course was brought in on Clara's arms, chocolate tarts with a seam of raspberry. She set one in front of me and I caught her wrist briefly. "Thank you." She squeezed my fingers with the quick pressure of someone standing beside a hospital bed. When she moved away, I lifted my eyes to the mantel. The honeymoon photograph was not there. In its place, the silver vase caught and threw the light as if it had a job to do and was pleased to be paid well for doing it. After coffee, Vanessa stood to make a toast. To new partnerships, she said, to community, to making space for what is next. Glasses rose. She tipped hers slightly in my direction. And to Maggie, who has such a beautiful eye for history. "We are honored to steward it." The word steward landed in my chest like a cold coin. Guests murmured, impressed. Rick looked relieved. The ease in his shoulders told me he believed the evening had gone well. I brought my cup to my lips and tasted only bitterness. I tried to leave quietly. At the doorway, a young woman touched my elbow and said she hoped to be like me when she was older, surrounded by beautiful things. She did not wait for my reply. I walked the long runner back through the hall and up the stairs, steadying myself with the banister Edward had sanded and stained during one stubborn winter when the world had lost its shine. Upstairs, the rooms were dim and cool. I closed my door and sat on the edge of the bed, my palm pressed to the place where my heart felt tight. The muffled surge of voices rolled up through the floorboards. Someone laughed, then Vanessa again bright and practiced the metronome of the evening. I let my shoes slip off and tucked my feet beneath me like a girl. The mirror on the dresser showed a woman whose hair had thinned at the temples, whose mouth had learned new lines. I tried to picture the years layered behind that face. Edward at Logan with a bouquet of tulips. Rick on the front steps with a paper crown after a school play. The library the night we finished shelving the last row of books, my head resting against Edward's shoulder as the fire sank to embers. Those moments existed in the same rooms that now held strangers and a centerpiece made of painted branches. They did not vanish, I told myself. They moved back a step and waited. Downstairs, a chorus of appreciation rose for the chef. Vanessa called out instructions to the staff she had hired for the night. Rick thanked a guest for coming and made a promise to connect next week. To my own surprise, a cool kind of clarity settled in. I had been dismissed before at committees where younger voices turned the conversation and men handed me the final summary to type because my notes were neat. The sting was not unfamiliar. But never before had the dismissal come from my own son, from the quiet curve of his mouth that aligned itself with someone else while I was still speaking. I stood and crossed to the window. The streetlights cast shallow pools of gold on the pavement. A rideshare idled its driver's face lit blue by a screen. Behind me, the house kept breathing its new party breath. I rested my forehead against the glass and stayed there until the pain fogged. When I stepped back, there was a faint oval where the warmth of me had touched the cold world. It looked like a small ghost that had been trying to look out and changed its mind. The hallway outside my door creaked. Clara passed carrying a stack of folded cloths. She paused in the doorway. "Are you all right, Mrs. Holloway?" I nodded. She hesitated. "Would you like me to bring you tea?" I nodded again, and she vanished, returning a few minutes later with a cup that smelled of bergamot. She set it on the nightstand and covered my hand briefly with hers. "I will finish up downstairs. Try to rest." I sipped the tea and listened to the night change shape. Tires hummed, doors shut, laughter thinned. The last traces of perfume and wine began to rise up the stairwell. I switched off the bedside lamp and let the darkness settle. In the quiet, I felt the house tilt a degree the way an old ship makes a slow correction. Somewhere deep in its ribs, something learned how to bear a new kind of weight. I lay back against the pillows and matched my breathing to the steady groan of the timbers. The voices below flared once more, then fell away, and I understood that the evening had written a line I would not be able to erase. The house grew quiet after midnight, the kind of silence that comes only when guests have left, and the air still holds the residue of their laughter. I lay in bed with the covers pulled up, staring into the dark, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional tick of the old hallway clock. My body longed for rest, but my mind throbbed with the memory of Rick's laugh at the table, that small betrayal disguised as nothing. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe evenly, but voices drifted upward again, hushed at first, then sharper, carrying through the floorboards with cruel clarity. Vanessa's tone was clipped impatient. "This house is far too big for her. She can't manage it anymore. It is obvious." Rick's voice followed, lower, weary. "I know, but it is complicated. She loves this place." Vanessa gave a dry laugh. "Love does not mean capable. She should be somewhere safer. A nursing home would be ideal. Then this house could be what it was meant to be, not a museum." I pressed my hand against my chest, trying to still the sudden pounding of my heart. Each word struck like a nail being driven. My son did not protest, not in the way a son should. He sighed, and when he spoke again, his words cut worse than hers. "Maybe you are right. She has been forgetting things, clinging to the past. She deserves care, but she cannot keep living like this." The ceiling above me seemed to sink. I gripped the sheets to anchor myself, my body trembling with a mix of rage and despair. They were not just whispering out of frustration, not speaking in the heat of a moment. They were making plans. Plans to push me aside, to decide for me, as if I were already incapable, as if my life were theirs to arrange. I turned my face into the pillow to muffle the sound of my own breath. A memory came unbidden, Edward's voice, soft but firm, from years ago when Rick was still a boy. "Never let anyone run your life for you, Maggie. Not politicians, not colleagues, not even family. Especially not family." I had laughed, then teasing him about his diplomat's paranoia. But he had not laughed. He had looked at me with those steady gray eyes and said, "Promise me." I had promised. And yet here I was lying still, while my son and his wife dismantled my future downstairs. The murmurs grew softer, punctuated by the clink of glasses being set aside. I heard Rick's voice say goodnight, a door closing, and then nothing. The house returned to silence, but it was no longer the silence I had known. This was a silence of occupation, a silence where my own footsteps felt unwelcome. I rose and pulled on my robe. The hallway was dark except for the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through stained glass. I padded quietly to the top of the staircase and listened. No sound came from the first floor. I descended slowly, hand trailing the banister, each creak of the wood louder than my breath. The dining room smelled faintly of wax and wine. Glasses still sat on the table half full. Napkins abandoned the white cloth dotted with crumbs, evidence of their triumph. In the living room, the mantel gleamed with the new vase, its metallic sheen catching the moonlight. I stared at it until my throat ached. Edward's photo was nowhere to be seen. For a moment, I saw not just Vanessa's hand in this, but Rick's. His silence, his alignment with her laughter, his weary agreement just minutes ago. My son was not simply avoiding conflict. He was standing on her side. I sank into Edward's armchair, the leather cool against my skin. My hands shook as I pressed them into my lap. The room blurred until tears burned my eyes. Memories came like ghosts, Edward carrying Rick on his shoulders across the Boston Common. Rick racing up these same stairs with a comic book in hand. Rick asking for help with a college application at this very desk. A lifetime of love and sacrifice, and now he spoke of sending me to a nursing home as if I were some stranger they barely tolerated. The night dragged on, each hour marked by the relentless ticking of the hallway clock. I did not return to bed. I sat in the chair with the shadows and let the realization harden inside me. Rick was not confused, not trapped. He had made a choice. He had chosen her, and in doing so, he had chosen against me. When dawn finally came, the house felt different, like it belonged to someone else entirely. The pale light touched the drapes Vanessa had hung, glinted on the vase she prized, revealed the bare shelves where my books once stood. I stood slowly, my knees stiff, and walked back upstairs. At my dressing table, I caught my own reflection, eyes, swollen hair, flattened from a sleepless night. But beneath the exhaustion, a new line had been drawn in my face. It was not weakness. It was resolve. Edward's voice echoed again the promise I had once made. I whispered it aloud, now my lips barely moving. I will not let them take this from me. I will not let anyone decide my life for me. Outside, the city stirred to life, car doors slamming, birds calling, a jogger's footsteps tapping the sidewalk. The world moved forward as it always did. Inside, I sat at the edge of my bed and let the morning air settle around me. The hurt was raw, but beneath it something stronger was beginning to form. A line had been crossed, and I could never step back over it. Rick surprised me the following Sunday by suggesting a family dinner, just the three of us. He said it with that careful smile he used as a boy when he wanted something extra, a cookie before bed or a later curfew. For a moment I almost believed him, almost thought perhaps he had seen the hurt of the other night and wanted to mend it. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I chose my favorite blue silk dress, the one Edward had brought me from a trip to Tokyo decades ago. The fabric shimmered faintly in the light, its weight comforting on my shoulders. I clasped my pearls, a necklace I wore only for special occasions, and looked at myself in the mirror. A part of me hoped Rick would notice, that he might remember how often his father admired this very look. When I entered the living room, Vanessa was already there, her legs crossed neatly, a glass of wine in hand. Her eyes swept over me and her lips curved into something close to a smile. How elegant, she said, her tone soaked with sugar. That dress must have been quite fashionable once. My spine stiffened, but I let the comment pass. Rick came in from the kitchen with a bottle of Bordeaux. He paused, looked me up and down, and for a fleeting second his face softened. "You look nice, Mom." He kissed my cheek quickly before moving to open the wine. The table had been set in the smaller dining room, not the grand one we used for holidays. White china gleamed beneath the chandelier. Vanessa had arranged it all I could tell. The silver was polished, but the centerpiece was her sterile-style succulents in glass cubes. I sat where my card waited opposite her with Rick between us like a referee already weary of the game. We began with asparagus soup, my recipe, though I suspected Clara had been pressed into making it for show. I complimented her effort aloud, hoping to draw Rick's attention to the quiet loyalty of the woman who had worked beside me for years. Delicious as always, I said, dipping my spoon. Vanessa set her spoon down almost untouched. A little bland, she murmured, but fine for Sunday. Rick shifted in his seat but said nothing. He spoke instead of work, describing a renovation project his firm had taken on the restoration of an old theater in downtown Boston. His eyes lit when he talked about the architecture, and for a moment he looked like the boy who once built towers of blocks across my carpet. "That's wonderful," I said warmly. "Your father would be proud." At the mention of Edward, a flicker crossed Rick's face, pride mingled with discomfort. "Yes, maybe," he said softly before moving quickly on. Vanessa tapped her fingers against her glass. "Honestly," she said, "I don't understand why anyone would pour money into keeping crumbling theaters alive." "Wouldn't it be better to build something modern and useful?" I bristled. "Historic places carry the soul of a city," I said. "They teach us who we were. Without them, everything becomes disposable." She smiled thinly. "Like your antiques. Trinkets that gather dust when the money could be used for something practical." The air between us tightened. I looked at Rick, waiting, praying for him to defend me. He glanced between us, then cleared his throat. "Mom, she has a point. Maybe not in those words, but sometimes you do hold on to things too tightly." My spoon slipped back into the bowl with a quiet splash. Clara entered then with the roast duck, fragrant and rich. She placed it carefully before us and retreated. The silence hung heavy as Rick poured the wine. We forced small talk, weather, and gallery exhibits, the trivial things that fill space when truth cannot be spoken. My heart pounded with each sip, with each laugh that sounded too hollow. When dessert arrived, I asked for tea. Clara brought a tray with cups and my beloved Earl Grey. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the pot. "Let me," I said gently, taking it from her. I leaned over to pour into Vanessa's cup. Somehow the pot tipped. Perhaps the cloth shifted, or perhaps my hand shook more than I realized. Hot tea spilled across her lap, staining the pale silk dress she wore, the embroidery darkening instantly. She shot to her feet with a shriek, the chair scraping violently against the floor. "Oh my God, this is Valentino!" she cried, shaking the fabric as if she could undo the damage. I jumped up too horrified. "I am so sorry," I said, grabbing a napkin, reaching toward her. "It was an accident." She slapped the napkin away. "Of course you didn't mean to," she snapped, her voice high and sharp. "Just like you didn't mean to criticize every change I've made. Just like you didn't mean to humiliate me in front of my guests." Her words grew louder, faster. My heart thudded in my chest. Rick rose, his hands raised. "Vanessa, calm down, it was just," but she cut him off with a sudden motion, her hand swinging before I could even breathe. The slap cracked across my cheek, hot and stinging, the sound echoing in the small room. My knees buckled and I caught the edge of the table to steady myself. The room froze. Clara gasped from the doorway, her hands flying to her mouth. I touched my cheek, unable to comprehend what had happened. My daughter-in-law had struck me, in my own house. I turned to Rick, searching his face for outrage, for protection, for anything. He stared at me pale, his mouth open but empty of words. At last he whispered, "You shouldn't have upset her mom." The ache in my chest was worse than the burning on my skin. Vanessa stood trembling with anger, her ruined dress clinging to her legs. She looked triumphant, unashamed. I straightened slowly, drawing myself up as tall as I could manage, my hand still pressed to my cheek. The silence stretched thick and suffocating until the clock in the hall struck 8. Its chime was steady, unyielding, and it filled the space where my son's voice should have been. Rick finally broke the stillness with words that cut sharper than the slap itself. "Mom, you provoked her. You have to understand." His voice was cold measured, as though he were explaining a misstep in business rather than defending his own mother. My breath caught and I stared at him, waiting for a flicker of shame, but there was nothing in his face but resignation. My hand trembled against my cheek. "Provoked her," I repeated softly, almost to myself. The words tasted bitter on my tongue. Vanessa stood beside him, chest heaving, the ruined silk of her dress clinging damply to her legs. Her eyes glinted with satisfaction, as if his allegiance had been earned at last. Clara stepped forward from the doorway, unable to remain hidden. "Mrs. Holloway," she whispered urgently, her hands reaching for my arm. "Let me help you sit." Her presence steadied me, though my knees still threatened to give way. She guided me back into Edward's old chair at the corner of the room, her touch gentle, protective. Vanessa huffed, dabbing her dress with a napkin, then shot a pointed look at Rick. "You see," she said, her tone pitched just enough to sound injured rather than triumphant. "This is what I deal with. The constant sabotage, the accidents that are never really accidents." Rick turned toward her, his hand brushing her elbow, murmuring something meant to soothe. My stomach twisted. I lifted my chin, forcing my voice to rise above the pounding in my ears. "If you choose your wife over your mother, Rick, you will lose everything." The words came before I had time to temper them. They rang in the air, sharp and final, a verdict delivered. Rick stiffened. His eyes darted to me, wide with shock, then narrowed. "Don't make threats, Mom. You are upset. We can talk about this later when everyone has calmed down." He was already retreating behind that careful wall he had built, the one that always allowed him to avoid the truth. Vanessa let out a short laugh, one without humor. "You hear her, Rick. She is threatening us in her own house. What more proof do you need that she cannot be reasoned with?" Clara bristled, her lips parting as if to speak, but I touched her hand to stop her. She had seen enough, and her testimony would matter more if she was not dragged into open conflict now. I steadied my breathing, ignoring the sting on my skin, and spoke again, my words quieter but heavy with resolve. "I have given my life to raising you, Rick. I gave you everything. And tonight you stood silent while your wife raised her hand against me. That silence was louder than any strike. For a moment I thought I saw something falter in him, the barest crack in his composure. But Vanessa's voice slid in quickly, silken and sharp. "She is trying to manipulate you with guilt. That is what she always does. You know it." Rick looked at her, then back at me, and the crack sealed shut. I could almost hear the lock turn as his choice became clear. He reached for her hand and clasped it tightly. "We need to end this conversation," he said. "It has gone too far." Clara drew herself taller, her small frame squared like a soldier. "Mr. Holloway, with respect, what I witnessed tonight was inexcusable. Your mother did nothing to deserve that." Vanessa whirled on her. "Stay out of this!" Out. "You are just the help." Clara's face flushed, but she did not retreat. "I am not blind," she said firmly. "I saw what happened. I rose slowly from the chair, every bone in my body stiff, but my voice steady. "That will be enough. Clara, thank you. Please leave us for now." She hesitated, then nodded, squeezing my shoulder before slipping out her footsteps quick along the hall. The three of us remained bound by silence more dangerous than shouting. I looked at Rick, the boy I had once carried through sickness, the young man I had pushed through college with pride, the only family left to me. He avoided my gaze, staring at the floor as if it held the answer he refused to speak. "I will not forget this night," I said quietly, "nor will I forgive it." Vanessa's smirk widened, but Rick flinched. I turned and walked toward the stairs, my back straight each step, deliberate. Behind me I heard Vanessa muttering, her voice dripping with triumph, and Rick murmuring in low tones meant to calm her. He had chosen. At the top of the stairs, I paused, gripping the banister. My cheek still burned, but deeper than that was the raw wound of betrayal. Edward's words echoed in my head, that warning never to let anyone control my life, not even our son. I had thought it was a caution spoken out of worry. Now I understood it was prophecy. In my room, I closed the door and sat on the bed, the pearls cool against my throat. My reflection in the mirror showed a woman marked, but not broken. My hand fell into my lap, and I whispered into the emptiness, "He is no longer mine." The house was quiet now, but it was a quiet poisoned by the truth. Rick had not simply failed me. He had aligned himself against me. The clock in the hall struck the quarter hour, each chime steady and unyielding. I listened until the sound faded, then lay back against the pillows, staring into the dark. Somewhere in the distance, laughter from the street drifted faintly, careless and free. I closed my eyes and let the silence return the decision already forming in my chest like iron. The next morning, I rose earlier than usual, dressing with deliberate care, choosing a navy skirt and a cream blouse that reminded me of the years I worked alongside Edward at embassy dinners. I called Jonathan Price, the attorney who had been with our family for decades, and asked him to meet me in his office downtown. His voice was calm, measured, and without hesitation he said he could rearrange his morning schedule. That small kindness steadied me. The city streets were brisk with commuters when I stepped out of the cab. Boston's air carried a sharpness that woke my senses, and for the first time in weeks, I felt my steps had purpose. Jonathan's office was in a sandstone building near Beacon Hill, lined with oak and brass fixtures that had aged with dignity. Clara had insisted on accompanying me, saying she would wait in the lobby, and I let her, grateful for her loyalty, though I did not say it aloud. Jonathan rose when I entered his tall frame, and gray hair lending him the authority that had always comforted me. He gestured to the leather chair across from his desk. "Maggie," he said softly, "I read your message. Tell me what happened." I told him everything. Vanessa's constant intrusions, the way Rick laughed along with her, the slap at dinner, the words that followed. As I spoke, my voice wavered, but I kept going, laying bare the humiliation that had cracked open the truth of my son's betrayal. Jonathan listened without interrupting, his eyes narrowing, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. When I finished, he exhaled heavily. "This is elder abuse, Maggie. What she did to you, what he allowed, it fits the definition. You could press charges." His tone was steady, but the weight of the words shook me. I imagined police officers in the halls of my home, reporters, perhaps neighbors whispering. That was not the path I wanted, not yet. I shook my head. I do not want a court battle. I do not want my life dragged into public spectacle. I only want to protect what is mine, what Edward and I built, from falling into their hands. Jonathan leaned forward. Then we change your will. We make it airtight, unshakable. And if you wish, we prepare statements so that when the time comes, they will know precisely why. His words steadied the iron already forming in me. Yes, I said, my voice firmer. That is what I want. We spent hours going through the details. The house with its history and collection would be transferred into a trust for the city, converted into a small museum under my name, and Edward's a place where the public could learn from the antiques we had gathered over a lifetime. My collection of miniatures and porcelain would go to Emily Carter, the young restorer who lived next door. She had come into my life like a spring breeze after Edward's death, full of talent and reverence for the past. She understood the weight of history, the delicate care of preservation. In her hands, my treasures would live, not be discarded. For Clara, I asked that a retirement fund be created enough to let her rest comfortably when she chose to stop working. She had given me her loyalty, her companionship, her quiet defiance in the face of Vanessa's cruelty. She deserved security more than anyone. And for the future, I created the Edward Holloway Fund, a scholarship for art students in his name. Edward always believed education was the finest legacy. To know that young artists would carry his name forward felt like justice. Jonathan's pen scratched across the draft documents, his questions precise, his instructions clear. At last, he slid the papers across the desk, his eyes meeting mine. These are preliminary. We can finalize them tomorrow, but if you sign here, it confirms your intent. I picked up the pen. My hand trembled slightly as the ink flowed, but the stroke was clean, deliberate. When I set the pen down, a weight lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in months, I felt control return. Jonathan closed the folder with a decisive click. One more thing, Maggie. Do you want this to be private until your passing, or do you want it read aloud to them now I met his gaze? I want them to hear it. I want them to see what their choices have cost. His eyes softened, but he nodded without argument. Then we will prepare the announcement. When I stepped back into the lobby, Clara rose from her chair. Her face was anxious until she saw mine. Is it done, ma'am? She asked in a hushed voice. It is begun, I said, and for the first time, I allowed myself a smile. The cab ride home was quiet, the city rolling by in muted shades of gray. My cheek still carried the memory of Vanessa's hand, but the fire inside me burned hotter than any sting. This house, my life, my legacy would not be theirs to squander. That evening, I walked through each room with new eyes. The parlor stripped of Edward's photograph, the library shelves bare where my books had been, the dining room still echoing with laughter that had not been mine. Each change Vanessa had made now seemed temporary, an overlay that would be peeled away. The house itself knew who it belonged to. In the conservatory, I paused before the violets she had replaced with her lifeless succulents. Their absence pained me, but I bent down, touching the rim of the empty pot, and whispered to myself, soon. When I retired for the night, I opened Edward's photo album and traced the line of his jaw with my fingertip. I told him quietly of what I had done of the fund, the museum, the way his name would live. For a moment, I almost imagined his voice answering his approval, steady and warm. The house was silent again, but it was no longer the silence of defeat. It was the silence before revelation, the pause before truth is spoken aloud. I folded the covers back, slid into bed, and let the weight of my decision settle into my bones. Tomorrow they would learn. Morning came gray and wet, the kind of Boston drizzle that seeps into your bones, but Rick was not at the house to notice it. He had left early driving down to New York for a meeting at Davis and Partners, the architectural firm where he was still only a junior partner. I heard the front door slam, and while I was pouring my tea, his voice clipped as he told Vanessa he would call later. Clara raised an eyebrow but said nothing. I learned later what happened that day through whispers that reached me like wind carrying pieces of a storm. Rick walked into the sleek lobby of Davis and Partners with his shoulders squared, rehearsing lines in his head about growth vision independence. He wanted his own studio. He wanted to break free, or at least that is what he told himself. But the truth was harsher. Mark Davis, the senior partner, greeted him in the glass-walled conference room. Mark was a man in his late 50s, polished, respected, known for sniffing out weakness the way a banker knows a bad loan. Rick laid out his proposal blueprints, carefully rolled numbers on spreadsheets, promises of clientele and prestige. He wanted the firm to back him in starting a new studio under his name with capital to cover the first 3 years. Mark listened, nodding, his fingers steepled. Then he leaned back in his chair, his gaze sharp. "Rick, I like your ambition, but I have to be frank. There are concerns." Rick stiffened. "Concerns?" Mark tapped the folder with one finger. "People talk. This is New York word spreads. I hear you are living in your mother's house in Boston, that your wife is running things there. That does not exactly inspire confidence in your independence or your judgment." Rick flushed, his jaw tightening. "That is temporary," he said quickly. "Our condo in Manhattan is under renovation." Mark's eyes did not waver. For over 2 years, that excuse has grown thin. Clients invest not just in work, but in reputation. And right now, your reputation is shaky. I cannot, in good conscience, allocate firm resources to an unproven venture. The rejection landed like a hammer. Rick's hand clenched around his pen until the plastic cracked. He forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. "I see," he said through his teeth. "Thank you for your honesty." When he left the office, the whispers followed. Associates trading glances, someone muttering about him being the guy who lets his wife pick out curtains while his mother pays the bills. He heard the laughter, tried to drown it out with the slam of the stairwell door. Driving back north on the interstate, his mind churned. Every mile of asphalt only deepened his fury. He had been humiliated, dismissed, made small. And in his mind, the reason was not his lack of discipline or vision. It was me. Me and the house. If he could secure the Holloway estate, the Victorian with its reputation and history, he could finally silence the whispers. The mansion would be his leverage, his prestige, the foundation of the empire he felt entitled to build. That evening when he returned, I heard the heavy slam of his car door, the pounding of his steps across the porch. Vanessa met him in the foyer. From the conservatory, I caught fragments of their voices, sharp, urgent. He told her about the meeting, about Mark's refusal, about the whispers that branded him weak. She fumed, swearing that people would regret underestimating them, but beneath the fury I heard the desperation. "We need the house," Rick muttered, his voice breaking through clearly. "It is the only way. Without it, no one will ever take me seriously." Vanessa's reply was lower, almost a hiss, but I caught enough. "Then we make sure it becomes ours no matter what your mother says." I closed my book and set it gently on the table, my pulse steady despite the words that floated through the air like smoke. Their greed had become a living thing, coiling tighter each day. But so had my resolve. The will had been signed in draft, the finalization only days away. Whatever storms they planned to raise the ground beneath them was already slipping. I rose, walked to the window, and looked out into the rain-soaked garden. The violets were gone, the succulents glistened under the drizzle, but in my mind, I saw the house as it had been filled with warmth and meaning. They thought it was an asset to seize a trophy to flaunt. They did not understand it was a legacy to protect. Behind me, Mrs. Crawford house settled into uneasy silence. I drew the curtains and prepared for the next battle of iron, decision no longer forming, but hardened ready. The next morning carried a strange lightness, the kind that comes after a storm has declared itself. I was in the conservatory trimming the leaves of a plant that had grown unruly when Clara announced that Emily Carter was at the door. She stepped in carrying a folder under one arm, her hair pulled back in a neat bun that made her look both professional and unguarded. She smiled with the shy warmth of someone who brings more than she knows she carries. I asked her to join me, and we settled at the wicker table among the faint scent of earth and damp leaves. She opened her folder and began to show me the latest photographs from her restoration work, the details of an oak writing desk she had rescued from mildew, the delicate layers of varnish she had tested and replaced. Her voice carried the thrill of creation disguised as repair. I listened, nodding, and felt the urge swell inside me to tell her what I had decided. I waited until her words paused. "Emily," I said quietly, "there is something you should know." Her eyes lifted, curious. I leaned forward and folded my hands. "I met with my attorney. I am making changes to my will." She blinked, surprised, as if I had suddenly shifted the ground beneath us. I continued before doubt could creep into my own voice. "The house will become a museum open to the city. My collection will be preserved, but it needs a steward, someone who values history for its soul, not its price." She frowned slightly, unsure if she was meant to nod or simply listen. Then I said her name. "Emily, that person is you. I want you to have the collection. I also want you to take the small cottage on Martha's vineyard. You once told me you dreamed of a workshop by the sea. Now you will have it." The folder slipped in her lap. For a moment she looked as if I had spoken a foreign tongue. Then her eyes filled, and she pressed a hand against her mouth. "Mrs. Holloway," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why me? I am not family." I smiled at her trembling honesty. "Because you cherish what my own son dismissed. Because you respect the past. Because you remind me of the daughter I never had." Tears slid down her cheeks. She shook her head as if trying to refuse, then gave up and let them fall. I reached across the table and laid my hand over hers. She gripped it like an anchor. Finally, she said, "You are my family. You have been a mentor, a guide, but more than that, a mother in ways I never knew I needed." The words pressed into me like balm on a wound. A daughter born not of blood, but of choice. I squeezed her hand. "Then honor this house and this legacy. Protect it when I no longer can?" She nodded fiercely, her tears drying into resolve. "I will," she said. "I promise you I will." We sat in silence, the sound of a sparrow fluttering against the glass filling the moment. Clara entered quietly with tea, her eyes flicking between us, understanding more than words revealed. She set the tray down and left, closing the door behind her with care. Emily lifted her cup with both hands still trembling. I told her more, not every detail, but enough. The scholarship in Edward's name, the retirement plan for Clara, the museum that would carry our story forward. She listened with reverence, her fingers tightening around the porcelain. When I finished, she shook her head in wonder. You have thought of everything. I smiled faintly. I have had long nights to think. She looked around the conservatory at the worn wicker, the stained glass catching the light, the faint smell of the violets that had once filled the sills. This is your heart, she said softly. I will keep it safe. Her words lingered long after she left the front door closing with a gentleness that was rare in this house now. I stood at the window and watched her cross the garden path, her folder pressed to her chest, her steps light but purposeful. She glanced back once, and when our eyes met through the glass, she smiled with a loyalty that asked for nothing in return. I turned back to the room, the tea cooling on the table, and let the quiet settle around me. Somewhere in the house, Vanessa moved her heels sharp against the floor, her voice trailing in a phone call. She would never know the conversation that had just taken place, not until it was too late. I sat back in the wicker chair and closed my eyes. For the first time in months, I did not feel cornered. I felt allied. Blood had betrayed me, but spirit had given me a daughter. It was enough to keep me steady for what was still to come. The morning of the announcement broke bright and sharp, as if the sky itself wanted to strip away shadows. I dressed carefully the dark navy suit Edward always called my armor, and pinned my hair with the silver comb he had given me on our 40th anniversary. Clara moved through the hall with more urgency than usual, polishing surfaces already clean, setting out chairs in the library under my direction. She knew what this day meant. Jonathan Price arrived precisely at 11, his tall frame filling the doorway, his leather briefcase worn smooth by decades of use. He greeted me with a firm nod and a measured smile before stepping inside. Emily followed shortly after, her green dress, simple but dignified, her eyes darting around as if she sensed the tension vibrating through the walls. She sat quietly near the far end of the table, her hands folded. The sound of the front door opening again pulled my gaze. Rick walked in with Vanessa beside him. He wore a suit too polished for an ordinary morning, his tie pulled taut, his eyes wary. Vanessa, on the other hand, radiated impatience, her heels striking the wood with sharp authority, as if she owned the place. She took in the chairs, the presence of Emily, the briefcase on the oak table, and her mouth curved in something between contempt and triumph. They sat across from me. Rick adjusted his cufflinks with a forced calm. Vanessa crossed her legs and leaned back, one arm draped along the chair in casual possession. Clara slipped quietly into a seat near the door, her hands folded in her lap, her presence steady. Jonathan cleared his throat, put on his glasses, and began. We are gathered here at the request of Mrs. Margaret Holloway to read into record the terms of her revised will. As a matter of record, he continued, I will state that Mrs. Holloway's capacity has been confirmed by Dr. Henson yesterday. She is of sound mind, fully aware of her decisions. Vanessa shifted in her seat, the smirk faltering for a breath. Rick's jaw clenched. I sat straight, my hands resting calmly on the table. Jonathan unfolded the first document, and his voice carried evenly through the room. The Holloway residence, located at 14 Linden Avenue, Boston, will, upon Mrs. Holloway's passing, be transferred to the City of Boston to serve as the Holloway Museum of Decorative Arts. Its furnishings, collections, and structure are to be preserved intact as a matter of cultural heritage. Emily's lips parted slightly, her eyes filling with both awe and weight. Vanessa made a soft, scoffing sound and muttered something under her breath. Rick glanced at her but said nothing. Jonathan continued. The collection of 18th and 19th century antiques, appraised at current market value in excess of $12 million, is bequeathed in its entirety to Miss Emily Carter of Beacon Hill, on the grounds of her professional credentials and demonstrated respect for preservation. She is also granted the cottage on Martha's Vineyard to establish a restoration workshop. Emily's hand trembled as she brought it to her mouth. Tears rimmed her eyes. Across the table, Vanessa sat forward abruptly, her voice sharp. "You cannot be serious. This is absurd. She is no one." Rick placed a hand on her arm, but she jerked it away. Jonathan did not pause. To Clara Bennett in faithful service for over 30 years, a retirement trust in the amount of $1 million is to be established with annual disbursements to ensure comfort and security. Clara gasped softly, her hand flying to her chest. She whispered, "Thank you, though I had not spoken." Jonathan's tone remained steady. Furthermore, a scholarship fund will be created in the name of the late Edward Holloway, supporting students of art history and restoration at Boston University. An initial endowment of $5 million will be allocated. For a moment, the room held a reverent silence. Then Jonathan turned the page, his voice tightening just enough to underscore the importance of what followed. As for Richard Holloway Jr. and his wife Vanessa Holloway, they are excluded from all major inheritance. The words struck like a hammer. Rick's eyes snapped to mine, searching, but I held his gaze with calm steel. Vanessa inhaled sharply and leaned forward, her nails tapping against the table. Jonathan went on. They are to receive a modest monthly allowance sufficient for living expenses, contingent upon one condition: neither shall set foot within the Holloway residence or its grounds either during Mrs. Holloway's lifetime or after her passing. Violation of this condition will result in immediate termination of said allowance, with funds redirected to the Edward Holloway Fund. The silence afterward was thick, vibrating like a struck chord. Rick's face paled, his lips parting, but no words emerging. Vanessa exploded. "This is outrageous. You cannot do this. This house is ours. Everything in it is ours by right." She shoved her chair back so hard it scraped the floor. "You are not in your right mind," she spat at me. Jonathan adjusted his glasses and said calmly, "The medical certification is in order. The will is legally sound. Your objections, Mrs. Holloway, are noted but irrelevant to the execution." Vanessa's face reddened. She pointed at Emily with a trembling finger. "You little vulture. You have been scheming with her, haven't you? You think you can take what belongs to us?" Emily straightened in her chair, her voice quiet but steady. "I never asked for this. Mrs. Holloway made her own decision." Vanessa let out a laugh that cracked into something bitter. "Rick, say something. Tell her she cannot erase us." But Rick sat frozen, his hands slack on the table, his eyes glassy, as though he had finally glimpsed the full weight of choices left unmade. I rose slowly, my chair creaking against the wood. My voice carried without shaking. "You both forced my hand long before this day. You mocked what mattered, you stripped this house of memory, and when your hand struck my face, my son stood still. A mother can forgive many things. Silence is not one of them." Vanessa shook with fury, her words tumbling too fast. "This is not over. We will contest. We will destroy this farce." Jonathan closed the file and tucked it into his briefcase. "You are free to attempt," he said evenly, "but be advised the documentation is airtight. Any challenge will be public record." Rick finally spoke, his voice low. "Mom." His eyes lifted to mine, filled with something like regret, but tangled too tightly with fear to be clean. I looked at him for a long moment and then turned away. The clock on the mantel chimed noon, its sound clear and unyielding. Clara wiped her eyes. Emily sat still, her hand pressed to the folder Jonathan had left with her. Vanessa seethed, her anger spilling into the air like smoke. Rick lowered his head into his hands. I stood by the window and felt the light fall across my shoulders. For the first time in months, perhaps years, I breathed without weight. The words had been spoken, and the truth was no longer mine to carry alone. Vanessa's chair screeched across the floor as she lunged toward the stack of documents Jonathan had left on the table. Her hands shook with rage as she tore the copy into jagged strips, the sound of paper ripping echoing like thunder in the quiet library. "You think you can bind us with this?" she shouted. Her face flushed, her voice cracking. "This house is mine. This family is mine." Jonathan calmly closed his briefcase unbothered. "The original Mrs. Holloway is secured at the bank." He said, his tone measured, patient, as though addressing a child mid-tantrum. "What you just destroyed was a courtesy copy." Her breath came in short gasps, and for a moment I thought she might throw the scraps at me. Rick stood behind her, his hand hovering uncertainly over her arm, but he didn't dare touch her. I remained by the window, my back straight, my voice calm. "Fury does not undo truth, Vanessa. You will learn that soon enough." Rick finally turned to me, his voice pleading softer than it had been in years. "Mom, can we talk alone? Just us." He gestured weakly toward the hall, his eyes darting from Jonathan to Emily to Clara, who all sat silently witnessing. I shook my head. "No, Rick. There is nothing left unsaid. You chose your path long ago." My voice dropped lower, steady but sharp. "You chose her over me, and now you face the consequence." Vanessa spun toward him, her eyes flashing. "Do not stand there begging her," she snapped. "She is an old woman clinging to dust and memories." Rick's face tightened, but he said nothing. The silence hung heavier than her words. Jonathan gathered his papers and stood. "I believe my role here is complete," he said. "Mrs. Holloway, I will file all necessary documentation with the court this week. Emily, I'll be in touch regarding the collection. Clara, the trust paperwork will be ready within days." He gave me a small nod, a look of respect, before stepping toward the door. Emily followed, pausing only to squeeze my hand, her eyes shining with quiet strength. Clara remained behind, hovering near the doorway, ready should I falter. When they were gone, Vanessa began pacing like a caged animal. She muttered under her breath about lawyers, appeals, scandals, her voice growing louder with each step. Rick slumped into a chair, his hands gripping his knees, his eyes vacant. For the first time, he looked smaller than his years, not a man but a boy lost in the wreckage of choices too late to undo. By evening, the echoes of the confrontation had begun to ripple outward. Clara returned from the market with whispers already circulating among the neighbors. They heard shouting, she said softly as she set down the bags. "People know something happened." I nodded. Let them know. The truth was no longer a secret. 2 days later, the fallout arrived at my doorstep in clearer form. An old acquaintance from the museum board called me with a careful tone. "Margaret, I don't mean to pry, but word is spreading about the will. Some people are saying Rick and Vanessa were cut off entirely. I told him the truth plainly. They were." He hesitated, then sighed with something close to approval. "You did what had to be done. These stories have a way of finding ears, but I suspect in this case it will work in your favor." Vanessa, however, was not spared the sting of gossip. Her colleagues in public relations began pulling away. Clara overheard a phone call one morning as she dusted the hall. A former client had declined to renew a contract, citing discomfort with the current publicity surrounding Vanessa Holloway. By the end of that week, 2 more clients had quietly severed ties. Her empire of curated charm was crumbling brick by brick. Rick faced his own reckoning. Mark Davis at Davis & Partners called him into the office. Rumor carried the conversation back to me through the whisper chain of this city. Mark told him plainly that with scandal attached to his family name, the firm could not risk funding his proposed studio. Too volatile, too much baggage. Rick left that office empty-handed, his ambitions collapsing under the weight of his silence at my table. One evening, I passed the open door of their bedroom. Vanessa's voice was high, shrill, almost frantic. "This is your fault," she hissed. "If you had defended me harder, if you had stood up to her, none of this would be happening." Rick muttered something I couldn't catch. The slam of a drawer followed, then silence. I walked on my steps steady. Their war was theirs alone now. I found my own refuge in the conservatory. Clara brought me a tray one afternoon, the steam rising from a fresh pot of Earl Grey, the scent of bergamot filling the air. I sat among the greenery, the sunlight streaking through glass, and let the quiet embrace me. For the first time in months, I did not feel watched, belittled, or silenced. I felt simply at peace. I sipped slowly the porcelain warm in my hand and thought of Edward. I could almost hear his voice steady and firm. "Do not let anyone rule your life, not even our son." I smiled faintly, the memory no longer sharp with grief, but softened with pride. I had honored his words. I had stood my ground. Outside, the garden swayed in the early evening breeze. Inside, the air was calm, the storm having spent itself. Vanessa's muffled rage still echoed through the halls, but it no longer reached me. Rick's footsteps carried no authority. Clara hummed softly in the kitchen. Emily's promise lingered in my ears. I raised my cup once more and let the taste settle on my tongue. The world beyond these walls might buzz with scandal and speculation, but here in the sanctuary Edward and I had built, I finally reclaimed my breath. The house, the history, and the peace of my own soul were mine again. Morning came with a clean brightness that made the stained glass throw soft patches of color across the hall. I walked the length of the landing and paused at the window that overlooked the garden. The gravel path was still dark with dew, the boxwoods neat again after Clara's careful trimming. For the first time in a long while, I felt my steps belonged to the house rather than tiptoe through it. Downstairs, the kettle started its gentle rattle, and the scent of Earl Grey rose as if the walls themselves exhaled. A courier arrived just after 9 with a thick envelope from Jonathan Price. Clara met him at the door and brought the packet in like a ceremonial object. Inside sat the bank confirmations for her retirement trust, the filing receipt for the museum transfer, and a note in Jonathan's precise hand about the timeline for the scholarship endowment. Clara read her page once, then again, and pressed it to her chest. She said she could finally sleep without counting expenses in the dark. She said she would stay through the transition and longer if I wished not, because she had to, but because she wanted to see the house open its next chapter. I told her that sounded like the finest plan either of us had made in years. She wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron and laughed that the bread would overproof if she kept crying over paperwork. Emily arrived late morning carrying a canvas tube and a measuring tape draped around her neck. She had a contractor with her, a quiet woman named Carol, who walked the rooms with reverent hands, noting light angles and floor loads without disturbing a thing. We started in the east parlor where the porcelain would go. Emily unrolled a neat sketch that showed low cases set away from the windows and a slim rail to guide visitors across the rugs without touching them. She spoke about sightlines and conservation bulbs and interpretive cards that honored the makers rather than merely labeling dates. In the dining room, she imagined a rotating table display that would teach how a piece is authenticated from the slip to the glaze to the kiln marks. In the library, she set aside the south wall for the Edward Holloway Fund plaque and a small reading nook with a ledger where visitors could write what beauty meant to them. By the time we reached the conservatory, the plan had become a map of rooms that felt freshly themselves. She paused there and grinned the way she does when craft and care click into place. She said she wanted the porcelain I loved to be the first thing a child remembered on the ride home. The city sent a representative that afternoon, a woman from Cultural Affairs, who carried a leather notebook and asked smart questions. She confirmed inspection dates for fire safety, reviewed the trust language, and explained how the neighborhood association would be invited to a preview evening. She admired the mantel and asked if the original tiles had been cataloged. I said yes, and for an instant I saw the museum as visitors might see it, not as a victory wrested from a fight, but as a gift made quietly inevitable. When the woman left, she shook my hand and said the house would do this city good. I believed her. All week, Rick and Vanessa packed. Their boxes appeared in the hall like small barricades, then disappeared into a rental van parked crooked at the curb. The arguments that had once ricocheted off these walls now sounded thin, the way echoes fade when a room empties. Vanessa moved fast, anger snapping at her heels. She made phone calls that started with charm and ended with clipped syllables. By Thursday, she had a list of clients who were on pause and a face that no longer knew where to rest. Rick kept to the bedroom or the porch, his voice low as if soft volume could prove he had not lost control. He asked twice to speak to me alone. The first time I told him there was nothing more to clarify. The second time I reminded him that the allowance depended on distance from this threshold. He stared past me toward the entry tiles he had scuffed as a boy and said he understood. He did not apologize. Perhaps he could not find the words. Perhaps the words would have asked him to change in a way he was not ready to do. On their last morning here, the sky hung the color of pewter and the air smelled like rain. Vanessa dragged the final suitcase across the floor, catching the corner on a rug Clara had straightened 1,000 times. She did not look back. Rick lifted a framed diploma from the hall table and tucked it under his arm. At the door he hesitated. He said he never thought it would come to this. I told him I had not thought so either once. He nodded as if that were an answer and stepped out. The engine coughed, then found itself, and the car rolled away. The street swallowed the sound. The house stood still. Something inside me, tight for so long, loosened without breaking. In the quiet that followed, we set to work. Clara polished the silver destined for the east parlor while humming a lullaby she claimed to have forgotten. Emily brought archival gloves by the dozen and glass microfiber cloths that pulled dust without scratching. Carol's team boxed the few modern intrusions for storage and peeled away adhesive hooks that had no business on plaster older than our grandparents. We found Edward's honeymoon photo at the back of a drawer in the guest room, tucked in a manila folder under a pile of design magazines. I held the frame and felt the small, sure weight of it in my hands. Emily suggested it anchor the museum's opening text, a quiet promise about love and time and the meaning of keeping. I agreed. Late one afternoon, The bank courier returned with the scholarship account details. I read the beneficiary line twice and imagined the first student who would see their tuition covered because a man named Edward believed in beautiful work made with patience and skill. I wrote a note to Jonathan asking that the fund welcome applicants who had changed careers late or who had taken time to care for family because second chances had shaped this house as surely as first loves had. Clara added a suggestion to offer travel stipends for students outside Boston. Emily said we should reserve 2 days each month for free public entry. I said yes to all of it. The museum felt less like a monument and more like a door held open. When the house closed for the evening, I walked alone through each room. The rugs breathed their faint wool scent. The wood banister kept its familiar smoothness under my palm. In the dining room, the table shone again with the polish Edward preferred mellow rather than bright. The mantel had regained its photograph. The vase had been moved to a closet where it could do no harm. I stopped beneath the staircase where Rick once stacked shoebox cities and told the air a simple truth. I had not wanted a fight. I had wanted a family. Life gave me a different kind of answer, and I had learned to accept it without surrendering myself. Emily joined me in the conservatory with a folded sheet of paper. She had drafted the museum dedication text, and she asked if I would listen while she read it aloud. She spoke of a house built on attention and a marriage built on respect of objects gathered not as trophies, but as conversations with time. She named me as founder and Edward as constant companion, and she thanked Clara by name for custodianship that kept beauty alive in small daily ways. She added a line about the sanctuary the house would offer to anyone who ever felt erased. When she finished, she looked up unsure. I told her the words were right. I told her that if I could have written my heart onto paper, it would have looked like that. The opening would not happen for months, but the date on the calendar reassured me. A future that belonged to the house was now anchored in ink. I poured tea for us, and we sat quietly until the light thinned and the plants closed for night. Emily gathered her notes and kissed my cheek lightly before leaving the door closing with a soft click. Clara turned off the hall lamp and the house accepted the dark without fear. I went to the library and stood before Edward's portrait. In the quiet, I told him I had done as he asked me to do. I had not allowed anyone to run my life, not even the boy we loved. I had protected what we made. I had chosen self-respect over appeasement, truth over peace at any price. I thanked him for the years we had, for the way his voice still steadied me from the other side of time. The words did not need to be spoken aloud for the room to hear them. At bedtime, I paused in the doorway and looked back once more. The rooms no longer felt like a battlefield. They felt like themselves. The air carried lavender from the sachets he loved. The clock in the hall kept even time. In the mirror, I saw a woman who had been hurt and had healed enough to place the pain where it belonged behind her rather than in front. My son chose his wife over his mother. Now they are cut out of my will forever, and the house stands as proof that some boundaries once set protect more than property. They protect dignity. They protect the quiet in which a life can finally breathe. If you were in my place, would you have kept silent and hoped for change, or would you have stood up and defended your dignity the way I did? Tell me what your heart says and why you would choose it so we can hold this conversation together here